Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We're continuing on, taking a look at the war settings, your war campaigns, anything where you have two or more nations or power groups that are clashing and duking it out, and just full on total war. Now, we last time we talked about how to throw together some different missions to give a war setting, a war campaign, more that, well, that military feel or aesthetic, and also how you go about rewarding your players when you're running this kind of a setting. Because, as I mentioned before, whatever hordes of treasure they may come across, they don't necessarily get to keep themselves, except for maybe under some specific situations. Rewards are going to be doled out by the generals or the lords or whoever may be in charge of the army, typically. Or if, depending on the style or the setup, the loot may be piled and congregated into one massive store that the leadership can go through and, well, again, start doling out rewards to everybody. Uh, it amounts to the same thing either way. I was trying to think of some differences, like with Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde, but uh, it amounted to the same thing with how they would distribute rewards, essentially. So, uh, anyways, moving on from there. Now, we talked about throwing together some of these missions, but when you're running these, there's still yet more that you can do to give the adventure, the missions, that more of that military-esque sort of feel. And one of my go-to examples that I use if I'm giving advice to any other friends of mine that may be asking how they go about running this kind of a campaign is actually one that I had run some time ago. It was using D20 Modern, and it was a World War II setting with, of course, fantasy elements thrown into it because I'm me and I really can't resist. But given the setting and I wanted to make it semi-historical, generally overall historically accurate, but the fantasy elements give it this element of covert operations. Everything's got to be kept quiet under wraps. With the D20 modern setting, the idea is, although there are some different variations on how you can play it, in the various books will offer you suggestions on this particular theme on how you incorporate magic. But the idea is generally that most people have a filter on their head. We just in general, we seek to try to rationalize and understand everything, anything and everything possible. So the stuff that comes up that is should be impossible, well, our brains block it out, rewrite it, find some way of alter it or explain it. It's like that person didn't throw a fireball, there's a gas leak and they threw a match, or there was gas on the ground, or they threw some incendiary explosive. Literally any answer is better than just it was magic. So people don't see the orcs, they don't see the goblins, they don't see the illithids, they don't see all the magic or the strange occurrences happening around them. They don't see anything occult related. None of that. Well, they may see the different glyphs and symbols, but that's just some sort of paganistic cult, some neo-pagans, some anything that they can do to distance what they're seeing from the supernatural is what happens. So those people, those characters that can see through that, who don't have that mental filter, that mental block in place, will will see what's actually going on and be able to respond and interact with it. And then on some level, uh, depending on how the player wants to set up their character at least, on some level they begin to exhibit their own supernatural levels of skill or ability and the like. Hence, they level up and they gain all these unique and weird abilities. So yeah, World War II though, largely the setting is going to be run historically, and I put the players in the units of rangers that actually scaled Point du Hoc, if I'm remembering it correctly. They scaled the wall there to attack some anti-air and artillery emplacements, and there were, of course, units of German soldiers there defending these things. And when they were scaling the cliffs, Germans were firing down, so the ranger marksmen started shooting back up to try to provide some cover for the people scaling the rock wall, setting the ropes and the pythons and the like, trying to create secure climb points so that the rest of the various units could start scaling up and the operation could really start to begin. And over the course of the fighting, there were a series of dugouts and trenches and the like that were set up as defensive emplacements. And this is where started trying to throw opportunities for the players to affect the outcome of this battle, not just the larger battle overall, but because these were two separate units, and I didn't want to run everybody, all, a couple hundred troops on each side. Essentially what I did was I would take two separate different colored D20s, declare this is the Wehrmacht, these are the US Rangers, roll them, and whoever got the higher number, their unit was performing better overall. Now, because the Germans were attacking from a fortified defensive position with all sorts of emplacements to aid them, they started off with a fairly significant bonus. But the Rangers could also call in artillery from the ships that were of course in the English Channel. And so, depending on how well the artillery fired, if the players could use their radio equipment to direct the fire accurately and have the ships fire for effect and accurately destroy different emplacements or start driving away enemy troops, well, those bonuses that the Wehrmacht would have would plummet. And that's the key right there, is the players affect the bonuses or penalties that each side can potentially get. And other things that I included in there were if the player's sniper character spotted a German radio soldier, well, they fire on that soldier. If they take him out, then the rest of the units have trouble coordinating. They can't call in their own artillery. They'll struggle to coordinate different units to try to repel back these invaders scaling up over the cliffs. They'll also have trouble calling in for any sort of air support. Not that there was a whole lot at the time during the Normandy invasion that the Germans had. The Luftwaffe, unfortunately, did not... Well, unfortunately for the Germans, I should say. Fortunately for the Allies had control of the skies. So the Luftwaffe did not. They were only able to make a couple of strafing runs before they had to retreat. German Air Force just did not have the strength to keep up at the time, especially not after the U.S. put all of its manufacturing infrastructure into total war mode. But a history lesson for another time. Point being, by taking out the communications equipment and the communications troops and officers, the German troops had less cohesion. Therefore, they had, even though they may have still been behind their defensive emplacements, because they couldn't coordinate, they couldn't operate as effectively against the rest of the Ranger platoons, which leveled the playing field and made it easier when I would make the rolls for the Rangers to start overcoming the Germans. And it got even better for them when they actually took over one of the anti-air emplacements and managed to get it swiveled around and started opening fire on the Wehrmacht reinforcements that were coming over the hill in all their trucks and transports. Really pushed things over the edge for them. There's also a point when they were going through the trenches. One of the players actually ran into a German officer, not a higher level officer, but still ran into him. It ended up being a close brawl with bayonets. They went at one another, and he took the officer out. And because he took the officer out, that represented a good deal of tactical knowledge and leadership that was just suddenly gone from the German soldiers. So his unit ended up routing, which again further decreased the overall bonuses. It actually started to send them into the negatives at that point. So again, made it easier for the Ranger unit to turn the tide, and it made the players feel like they were having an overall impact, and it got them thinking in a more strategic mindset than they otherwise might have done. Not that there isn't a certain level of tactical play, but there's also some role playing in it. And again, this just created this environment and this mindset for them that they needed to look out for radio equipment, communications posts, artillery emplacements, reinforced hard points that the enemy could potentially attack from. By destroying those, not only do they negate the straight up mechanical benefits, say, of cover that they might otherwise have gained, but it's also a point that the rest of the unit overall doesn't have to contend with. It's no longer an issue or as much of an obstacle. Or even better, if they capture that point and then turn it to use against the Germans, against the enemy, like they did with the anti-aircraft equipment. Now, the adventure did not go overall well for them, even at this starting point. When I had the rough calculations sort of set out ahead of time for me, and overall the way they performed, the various ranger platoons that came over the cliff, they did not have near the level of casualties that were sustained historically when this point was taken. But I had the non-historical moment come up when an SS colonel showed up with a couple of units and using magic to teleport himself and forces in, threw down a raise dead spell, and essentially set the undead going against the allies, the rangers, using their bayonets, their trenching tools, the weapons that they died with in their hands, including the firearms. It just played merry hell with everything, and it was fantastic. And by the time the different ranger platoons that had gone ahead circled back to try to help them, the Wehrmacht or the SS were either dead or gone. They had no idea what had happened. Basically, the other lieutenants and captains that showed up were just like, "What the hell? What the hell happened? Why did you guys slaughter each other?" And the player who was running this particular platoon was like, "They just disappeared." Absolutely sounded insane. It was perfect, and set up the next adventure real easy. It was fantastic. But that's just an example of how to do this. Now, this was a specific example where it was semi-historical and had, as much as a tabletop game can, a certain amount of realism to it, but I also included elements of the fantastic. And you can easily apply this mindset and this approach even to high fantasy settings, sci-fi settings, or if you're going for something that is straight, purely, as much as you can, historically accurate. It's easy enough to adapt this. It's broad and general enough in mechanical terms, and it should be easy to translate in some fashion from system to system. It may require a little bit of tweaking depending on the rules. For example, not every game uses a D20. Some rely on D100 rolls. Others will use D10s or just a bunch of D6s. It really just depends on the system you're running, but overall the idea and the principle should translate over easy enough and give you another tool that you can use to create this sense of taking a look at things as capturing this objective, annihilating this particular target, all these different ways to incorporate the players, get them in the right mindset for the style of game that you have set for them, and make them feel like they're rewarding them for getting into that mindset by making the larger combat roles easier for the units that they're assisting or a part of. And also, this is a way of incorporating them into larger units. They're not, in this case, they're special forces, but these are special forces units that were operating, in larger unit strength. It wasn't just a 10-man squad here or a 10-man squad there. It was platoons of troops moving along, and this allowed me and will allow you to have a general way of interpreting and describing how these larger units of a 100 or a few hundred or even a few thousand troops are moving and interacting with one another as the flow of combat progresses. So really, really fantastic overall. I find it fantastic. And by all means, I don't believe I'm the first person to come up with this, but I did put this together sort of from scratch based off of what would make sense. And I feel like this does make sense, but There are plenty of other systems out there, and please feel free to take any of this that I've described here, tweak it, and adjust it to your own game and your own settings, because this doesn't necessarily just apply to a larger combat setting. You know, if you're running a game that is focused more on, say, corporate raiding, you know, say you're running a Shadowrun game, but instead of Shadowrunners, it's the corporate executives that are planning and making moves, and on occasion, on the rare occasion, having to get their hands dirty doing, I don't know, coming in and playing that role that's typically reserved for that NPC big bad villain type, where they come in, beat the ever-loving snot out of a prisoner, or are the ones that actually pull the trigger on them and just kick their body down an elevator shaft. You know, I'm sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent here. Point is, if you're focusing on a larger, more skill and story-oriented game rather than something combat-focused, you can easily use this and adapt this to, you know, basically information wars and financial data being thrown back and forth as these various companies try to make different asset and stock acquisitions. It may not happen at quite the same pace or speed, but you can still make use of this quite easily and adapt it for a number of different uses. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Oh, and if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider going down there and throwing a like on the video. And if you've been enjoying the content here so far, maybe consider subscribing and becoming a member down here at the Gamers Den. We're always happy to have more people joining in on the discussion. Even if right now it's just a discussion of one and me sitting here, sadly alone at my computer, hoping for the day that some soul may take pity upon me and leave additional comments down in the section there and engage in vibrant discussion. But that's just me. Pity me not, for I am enriched by the activities I'm undertaking here. Thank you all for your time. Have yourselves a good night.